I've reached 1987 in my Famicom Disk System playthrough, and you really could consider 1987 to be the year of the FDS. It's the year with the highest number of releases, and we're going to see some great games, but there's a bit of a twist here. The disk system is actually already past its prime. Almost every big Famicom Disk System release that people think of has already happened. And we'll be seeing a really sharp slowdown in the pace of releases even by the end of 1987. Kicking things off for the peak of the disk system is a significant experiment of a game. Just 11 months after Zelda no Densetsu, we've got The Legend of Zelda 2, and yes, it's titled in English, Link no Boken. Zelda no Densetsu was a launch title for the disk system, the big must-own game that the platform launched with. It built on the nascent action puzzler genre and turned it into something that was very accessible for people, which naturally meant when it was time for a sequel, they changed everything. I'm going to start at the ending because I think it's important for context. I find Link no Boken to be an interesting game with a lot of clever systems that don't quite gel together. So I'm going to sound a bit down on the game, but it's not because I hate it. I might put it down as the best of the second-tier games. There's a lot to like here, and that makes it more disappointing when you run into the stuff that doesn't quite work. The plot of the game immediately follows up the previous one, making this the final game where the Zelda timeline will be coherent and make sense. After killing Ganon, Link hears about another Princess Zelda, this one trapped in an eternal slumber like Sleeping Beauty. And since his whole thing is saving Zeldas, he's going to go get the things that will let him access the hidden location of the third Triforce, which will then be used to wake the Princess Zelda up. All of that story is presented in English in the introduction, though it could use an editing pass. This is an early sign that Nintendo was looking at international markets with these games. The Legend of Zelda 2 is being prepared to be sold in the US alongside Japan. The obvious change in Link no Boken is that the action now takes place from a side view. Naturally, that changes the gameplay elements quite a bit. There's a lot of platforming in Link no Boken. You're gonna have to jump around all over the place. There's 7 palaces that you'll have to explore like this, corresponding towns for each of them, plus dozens of smaller locations that you'll find by exploring the vast world. You'll do that from an overhead view, and as you're walking around, if you get off the road, then monsters will appear and run around. In the Disk System version, they appear as those blobs. The yellow blobs are the weak ones, blue blobs are the tough ones, and red blobs are fairies. Snatching up a fairy when you encounter one restores Link's health. The other notable change in Link no Boken is that the game is now an RPG. In the original Zelda no Densetsu, and in most Zelda games afterwards, the only character feature that you could permanently increase was Link's health. In Link no Boken, however, you get experience points for defeating enemies, and when you reach a threshold, you level up and can increase a stat. You can increase your attack to do more damage, your life, which is actually your defense, or your magic, which helps bring down the cost of magic spells. Magic is also the stat that's probably going to be your lowest priority to increase, since the magic system in Link no Boken is one of the game's biggest weaknesses. Every town has a magic spell that you can acquire, usually by finding an item somewhere out in the world and bringing it back to somebody. If you wind up in the town first, you'll talk to them and they'll tell you what they're looking for, but if you're fully exploring, it's pretty likely that you've already come across what they want. You go into their house when they open the door, and meet an old wizard who will add a spell to your list. You access the list on your status screen by hitting Start, select a spell, and then cast it by pressing Select. You have a magic bar at the top, and each block in it represents 16 bits of magic. And the number next to the spell in the status screen is how much it costs to cast that spell. Leveling up your magic brings that cost down sometimes, for some spells. The cost of magic doesn't really scale linearly with any of them, and some spells just stop decreasing in cost altogether at a point. And because the cost of magic doesn't line up with the blocks, it winds up feeling like buying currency in a mobile game, where you can't ever just get the amount that you need. If an enemy drops a blue potion, it'll refill 1 block, and a red potion will refill your entire bar. Because it takes a while for the red potion to fill up the bar, you can pick up the potion, cast a spell, and then have the red potion refill that block you just spent. Red potions are also often found in statues in the temples, which makes them useful for recovery. Other things you can find just sitting around in the world include heart containers that extend your life bar 1 block, magic containers which do the same thing for your magic bar, and little dolls that act as extra lives, because Link now has lives. If you run out of lives and get a game over, then something happens to your levels. Everything gets flattened out. Between attack, magic, and life, whichever one was your lowest is what all 3 stats are now equal to. The cost to level them back up also gets reduced, as though you are just at that total level, but it can still be a pretty major setback. You'll probably want to prioritize upgrading your attack. As in most games, destroying enemies faster is more effective than any defensive option. And as for magic, it's just not really super useful until you find the healing spell. One other consideration when choosing what to level up is that increasing your magic or life fully restores those bars for you. That's something that you can take advantage of. In fact, there's a lot of strategies that you can apply here to maximize your experience gains and make your leveling extra effective. Link no Boken is a huge game. When I recorded previous episodes on Zelda no Densetsu, I completed the whole game in about 2 hours. I stopped my recording on this one at about 1.5 hours. That was when I had gotten my first game over in the second temple, though I had moved a lot further than that and double-backed. There's also a surprising amount of flexibility in Link no Boken. While Link starts out his adventure with nothing but his sword, there's a lot of things you can do without really progressing the game. In fact, one of the major strategies for dealing with the absurdly difficult endgame is to intentionally bypass a lot of the early stuff so that you can collect it at the end when it's more effective. For example, you don't have a candle at the start of the game which you need to light dark caves. But the early games have a pretty simple layout, and the number of enemies are both small, and they do enough overlapping of the graphics that you can see, that it's not especially difficult to make your way through them without a light source. Then you can collect some spells and permanent upgrades, plus do some leveling, before you make any progress in the quest. Now, I didn't do that while I was recording, because I kind of wanted to present the game as it's normally played, but I still kind of wound up doing some of that. Here's what I did during my 1.5 hour recording session. I set out from the temple, which you always return to when you start playing. Another quirk that becomes annoying when you get a game over when you're really far from it. I went to the starting town where I got the shield magic that cuts all damage in half, at least until you exit the screen that you're on. Got the first heart container, which is conveniently located near the first temple. Cleared out that first temple, getting the candle in the process. Picked up the magic container and idol, then turned the idol in for jump magic, which doubles your jump height. Made my way through the cave system to the swamps, but instead of heading around to the swamp temple, I headed south across the river to get the healing magic, and then went through the maze of caves that always gave you a problem when you were a kid, to get the hammer at the end, one of the few items usable on the overhead map, where it smashes rocks to clear paths. I picked up the other magic container that was sitting right there, headed over to the desert town where I learned to stab down while jumping, and also picked up fairy magic. Then it was off to the swamp palace, which I mostly made my way through, until I fell into a pit just a couple screens short of the boss. I was kind of hoping I'd get through the next temple before I had to stop, but a game over there meant I'd have to redo about 10 or 15 minutes, and that pushed pretty hard on my recording time. One quirk about the Famicom Disk System version is that the only way to pick something up is by stabbing it. This means that even though I got the fairy magic early, and could thus fly through a keyhole, I couldn't collect what was on the other side. Oh well, so it goes. Needless to say, Link no Boken was very popular in Japan. In fact, it was the highest reviewed game ever in Famitsu magazine, until 2 weeks later when Dragon Quest II came out. The game is still very popular in Japan. While Nintendo has re-released it a few times, I never really went back to this style of game with the Zelda series. Maybe they felt like they locked on to a winning formula with the next one. There are a few things worth mentioning about the differences between the Famicom Disk System version of Link no Boken and the cartridge version of Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. You see, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link is a bigger game than Link no Boken. This is the first time where we're really seeing games bump into the limitations of the disk system. All of the temples use the exact same graphics in the disk system version. For example, there wasn't any room for different styles of floors and pillars. And the cartridge has additional enemies and bosses. The disk system winds up repeating some. However, they also increase the difficulty for the cartridge version. Enemies do more damage, attack more aggressively, and it costs more to level yourself up. So Link no Boken is easier to play, but the Adventure of Link is a more complete experience. I've already given my conclusion, and I could go deeper onto certain aspects of the game that I don't care for, but I feel like there isn't really a need for it. The best thing that I can say here is that I was thinking that after I finish editing this one, maybe I'll go back and play a bit more. I still had another hour or two of play before I felt like the game turned really nasty. There's a lot to like in Link no Boken. It just doesn't quite live up to being a classic.